hatred, aggression, and oppression. These sentiments or states of being can breed feelings of resentment, anger, and fear, and ultimately lead to violence. Brutality, war, murder. These are things that most of us avoid at all costs, but we are often subjected to them and forced to deal with them, like it or not. What role does violence play in a civilized society? That's what we're here to discuss on tonight's episode of Pseudo-Intellectuals. Hello all, and welcome to tonight's show. Thanks for showing up. Jeffrey Pearson, Metalhead, Density, Al, Lynn Vermont. Thank you guys. I'm sure we got some other people lurking and some other people who will be listening later. Tonight, as always, Paul Chatlin is with us.
Say hey, Paul. Oh. Hey, everybody. We just lost Paul, and Ashley froze at the same time. This is John. There's Paul. He's back. Ashley's froze.
That,
Yeah, I lost my purpose.
You're right. There you go, guys. You're back on the air, but that was you both froze at the same time.
Quickly lose my train of thought. So, Paul, violence. We're going to be talking about that tonight, and we were discussing earlier. It's been on my mind, and it's all the conversations have been kind of leading up to it. And I like to think that I am a less violent person, or that I harbor less violent tendencies as I get older than I did when I was younger. But that rage, that aggression still wells up in me, and it's hard to fight sometimes. Paul, your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, as me and Ashley have had many discussions about this, I'm a little more sympathetic to, I guess we would call it political violence, but I prefer to refer to it as direct action and militant struggle, I guess. And that's one of the things that I kind of wanted to discuss tonight, is making a distinction between the violence that oppresses people and the violence that fights against that oppression. Now, if I'm capable of actually putting that distinction into a clear sentence, I don't know if I can, but hopefully we can make enough scenarios clear in this respect to where that distinction will be apparent without needing to be put into explicit terms, I guess.
Yeah. And you were reading a book by Peter Genderloo. Is that how you pronounce it?
I'm pretty sure it's Peter Genderloo. It could be Genderloos. It's a wacky sounding last name, but I've seen many reviews, and I'm pretty sure most of the time the S is silent. But anyway, yeah, I read one of the major books that I think is good, or is appropriate for this topic, and it's relatively new, and it's a scholar that's actually working today. It's called How Nonviolence Protects the State, and it's written by Peter Genderloo, and he is actually like a community organizer and a radical advocate. He does a lot of work with an organization called Redneck Revolt, which is like a white working class advocacy group. That anyway, he wrote this book called How Nonviolence Protects the State, and essentially what he lays out in this book is a criticism of pacifism and nonviolence. And according to him, what he's not advocating that violence is the way to go every time. Like, that's obvious, but what he is saying is that there are times when violence is appropriate, and what we have to do is figure out those times based on the contextual situation, right? So when we talk about like the war in Vietnam, right, there's a popular concept that the war, and we'll get to this later in more detail, but when you talk about the war in Vietnam, they talk about how it was, a lot of people want to say that the peace movement is what ended the war in Vietnam. And what Peter Genderloo says is that that's an oversimplification of what ended the war in Vietnam. There's different factors that go into it. For instance, the amazing military capabilities of the Viet Cong and the Vietnam people in general fighting America and fighting a land war in Asia, So essentially what the book is about is that there's a way that violence can be justified, and that nonviolence has often been just demonized from the start. And what he wants to do is to defetishize that concept of against violence, and to try to show that there is an appropriate use of violence within the context of political and struggles against oppression.
Sure, I could see that. Although I still might argue whether or not it's healthy to engage in that behavior, because the psychological toll, like that, it takes to engage in that violence, kind of alters your mindset. Well, we can get into that too. John, you want to roll the clip of that Peter Genderloo, and we can get a sense of who he is as a person.
Yeah, here's an interview with Peter Genderloo, and he's just going to discuss a little bit of the motivation behind his book.
Basically, the idea is that, well, especially in North America, pacifists and nonviolent advocates have had a very defining role and even a censoring role in determining what other people's participation can be in a whole range of social struggles, and that the way that they've affected social struggles has made it very much easier for the state to control those social struggles. That nonviolence plays a function of recuperating social struggles, of taking out their teeth, making them harmless, so that they can just exist in this sort of cesspool of democratic plurality, in which everything is okay, nothing can really be challenged or changed, and ideas, opinions can be expressed infinitely without ever having any real impact, without really translating into action. A lot of times people will justify nonviolence, making the very common sense, very simple, and ultimately false argument that violence is the government's strong suit, and it makes no sense to fight the violence of the government with violence of our own. And what they're doing is conflating very, very different activities. They're suggesting that somehow defending yourself against police violence, or destroying commodities, or taking over property, fighting to free prisoners, indigenous people fighting to take over stolen land, things of this nature, somehow has any similarities with governments carpet bombing villages, or using landmines, or police torturing people, or putting someone in prison. That just because by some linguistic coincidence these different things can be described as violence, that somehow there's not only similarities between them, but that they're the same thing, and that one is going to reproduce the other. When in fact, by fighting back, people actually raise the stakes of repression and oppression for the state, and actually make real short-term differences, and I think also have a greater potentiality of ultimately destroying the state and capitalism, and helping us create those worlds that we want.
You can cut it there. And I think it's kind of funny that he's doing that interview with. You can hear the kids playing in the background. He's at a park. It made me. I was thinking about the show earlier today as I was playing laser tag at a kid's birthday party. I was like, I feel so violent right now. I'm shooting children, women and children, But it's this whole. Again, you're acting, and I was teaching kids, if they they had this grenade, like this little rubber thing that sends out a sensor to your helmet or whatever that you're wearing. And I said, if you see that grenade, you jump on it, because that's 20 points that, we're all going to take those hits if you don't jump on the grenade. And I'm teaching them these tactics, and I'm like, I hope this is as far as it gets, is getting good at laser tag, but he made some good points though, I think, especially that last bit I like about how this notion of false equivalency that you'll hear people argue. Well, you hear Trump argue it on both sides when he uses the words both sides or something like that. And I know that's not exactly what Genderloo was talking about, because he was saying, the violence, done by police and the violence done to police, that it's somehow, equivalent.
Well, totally. I mean, if you think about like the violence of the war in Iraq, right? So we were sold this lie. The American people were sold a lie about the Iraq war. And based on them tricking us, we went to war, and tens of thousands of Iraqi civilians were killed, and that was because of our consent to let that happen. Now, is it more just for us to, since we made the decision to go to this unjust war, is it more just for us to stop it through force, to try to overthrow the military and stop it? And American lives are the ones that are lost because of the American mistake? Or is this just by us just letting Iraqis die, and we hope that through nonviolent resistance, eventually it will stop? And that's one of the things I wanted to talk about, is like, when we're complicit in the state, are we also complicit in the violence that state enacts?
Absolutely.
And therefore responsible for it.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But I think part of the problem that is raised by that is that, now whether this is true or not, like the state would have us believe that the drone strikes and things are saving more innocents than they might be killing.
Okay, but sure. But let's look at that logic right there. Right there, the state is saying that violence is justified when you're fighting against injustice.
Well, their violence.
So what I'm saying is, can that same logic be applied against the state?
Yeah. And I think it's interesting that I didn't grab media for this, but the occupation of the Malheur Wildlife Refuge, is a good example, and it's interesting. I feel like that was a little bit precedent setting, in that they let them go with just a slap on the wrist for the most part. These are armed occupationists on federal lands.
Oh, totally. Well, I mean, and that to me is just a indication of the white supremacy that's systemic in our system. I mean, you have violent assholes like that who had no reason to take over that stupid wildlife refuge. They just wanted to just be militiamen and carry their guns around. And then you have the comparison of how they were treated with the comparison of how Black Lives Matter were treated, or even the Standing Rock people. I mean, the Standing Rock people got like shot with water in freezing temperatures, and I think that's another thing that we should consider, is like, look at how incredibly strong the Standing Rock resistance was. And that was nonviolent. I admit that was nonviolent. And even with that insane turnout and the insane strength of those people, the government and the corporation absorbed it all, and the pipeline still happened. And even the people these people didn't even get violent. Some people just like sabotaged the pipeline, and they're freaking going into jail for 40 years. I mean, and that's what I think Genderloo's trying to say, is that in many ways, what he means by protecting the state is that nonviolence is really comfortable for bourgeois society. I mean, you look at like that, the Woman March, right? Like, that was an awesome thing. But in a lot of ways, you look at like Charlize Theron wearing her pussy hat and all of that, and it's just like, well, you have nothing to gain or lose from this struggle. And so, of course, this is sufficient for you because you've got no stakes, And so when people are actually affected by these situations, I mean, you think about like the disenfranchised Trump voter, we want to call them stupid and we want to call them, but really they're just desperate. And instead of turning to like direct action where they empower themselves, which is what I think, like political violence and stuff, they turn to, a freaking fascist authoritarian like Trump, and that's what I think is wrong, is we always, ever since we've let the state become our agency, we've just lost all of our power, I mean, and that's what I think direct action, militancy, and in the end, violent struggle does, is it brings the power back to the individual. It empowers us to affect change in our own lives.
Yeah. Although again, I'm going to call you. I hesitate to call Trump voters stupid, hard-headed, maybe, but
no, I wasn't even calling them stupid. I was just saying what the popular consensus view of them is, and instead of basically, I'm just saying that we all feel disempowered in a lot of ways. We feel impotent facing our political situation, and direct action to me is not just violence. I mean, it goes from like gardening to guerrilla gardening to volunteering for a food bank to volunteering at your homeless shelter to picking up arms and killing fascists. These are all ways of direct action. And that's what I think Genderlew's trying to say is he's like, we need a diversity of tactics to constantly fight oppression. And nonviolence is one of those things. That's absolutely true. We absolutely should always consider nonviolence. In fact, it's an extremely powerful tool. It's just not the only one, and we shouldn't reduce ourselves to it.
Well, let's talk for a minute about kind of where the most spotlight is now. The Antifa. When we talk about American politics and where we're at in. You'll hear that name mentioned more than any others when we're talking about fighting against state violence, right? And there's this one of these links here indicates that they're doing more harm than good. Well, actually, you've heard that from several places, anywhere from what's his name on the Daily Show, Trevor Noah, or
I mean, a lot of the popular liberal outlets are
right
all being a mouthpiece for that position. Yeah,
right, and it's easy to take, especially with things like Berkeley, where they're destroying property, like with the Milo Yiannopoulos thing.
Well, and that's another thing is when you think about it, and that's what I mean is you got to be context specific. So Antifa, I agree with on many respects, but when it came to Berkeley and Yiannopoulos' dumbass just basically baiting them into a conflict and knowing what the outcome was, Antifa needed to be more strategically coherent with that, and they needed to understand that that's what Milo Yiannopoulos was doing. Because after a while, it was just he was just trying to piss people off, piss Antifa off, so that they would be out of control, Yeah. And I think they learned from that in Berkeley, and that's what happened in Charlottesville, because that's why they were so successful against Charlottesville, is they learned from their mistakes in Berkeley.
Yeah. And I see that a little bit. It's a growing revolution, and there are going to be growing pains. There's a quote in that Pacific Standard article that is defending Antifa by Malcolm Harris. He says, when Antifa wins, there's little fighting, and participants move on to other things like disaster relief. When the fascists win, there are death camps.
Well, yeah, and I always think it's so funny is like when people demonize Antifa and anarchists, I just urge you to get to know who these people are, because they're usually skinny little nerdy fucks like me. We're not tough, scary, like badasses. It's usually like doctors or people that just value doing community service. Most of the time, it's just community organization. But that's what, a lot of these anti-fascists, when they're not out fighting back Nazis, they're in frickin' hurricane relief, or they're helping out at the local homeless shelter, or they're trying to set up squats, so that people that are homeless can have their own homes. I mean, I've got a buddy in England who's an anarchist, and he does Antifa work, but most of the time it's just awesome. All he does is find squats for people to live, and then after he finds them, he finds as many people as he can to go live in that squat, So it's a shame, because Antifa gets reduced to this single role in the public narrative. And yeah, they do that, but there's so much else to them, and they're not, I mean, maybe there are some people out there to pick a fight, but that's true of every single group, and it's not fair to boil them down to their worst members,
Sure. And Robert Pugwire was asking, are the anarchists violent, or is it anti-fascist, or both?
Well, I think there's
Julie Love was saying it's individual, and I kind of agree with that, but I'd like to hear you're more of an expert on it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on Antifa. I definitely am a sympathizer, and as far as I know, there are a lot of commonalities between Antifa and anarchism. It's just Antifa is not. It's more just a movement, whereas anarchism is an actual political position. Antifa is more just it's like a jumping onto some kind of inertia, basically. Whereas it's not a political ideology, really. It's just more of a reaction against fascism. Whereas anarchism is not
reaction. They have to define themselves somehow, right? And
and if you look, I mean, the title anti-fascist
right.
in itself says it's a reactionary movement, whereas anarchism is not reactionary. Anarchism is more, well, I guess it is to a certain extent, but anarchism is reactionary to different forces. Anarchism focuses on the state, whereas I'd say Antifa focuses on the state, but the forces that drive state oppression, and the more grassroots level of that oppression.
Although interestingly, it feels like either way, they're often fighting not as much the state as other. Well, certainly in the videos of Antifa, you see them clashing with Trump protesters or something. So they're not necessarily fighting the state. They're fighting those that are complicit in again ensuring that.
Well, I mean, in a lot of ways, those Trump supporters are very much like champions of the state. Like these are people that not just that they don't just like the state; they love the state. They are like ready to. I mean, they're like Hitler's brown shirts. You know, I mean, these are people that are going to enforce Trump's law. It's basically just like a religion. You know, like I mean, that's what's scary is nativism and nationalism, and I think that's one of the things that terrifies me, and that's why I'm an anarchist, is because I think that we continually forget the lessons of nationalism, and that nationalism and radical nationalism always ends up bad. It always ends up bad, and we just keep having to learn that lesson. And that's what I think. Go ahead.
I was going to say it also gives you rationale for being violent.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And I just want to go back to something you said a long time ago. You said something, you know, we're talking about the state being violent. And I think you said something, is violence against the state ever justified? And in this nation, considering the state is really made up of the people, that's for us to decide. But we let our government decide it. We believe the narrative of the government. No. Only our violence is okay. Your violence is not. Police violence is okay, but your violence against police is not okay. We're the only ones that have to accept that narrative.
Totally. Well, and that's the other thing is there's like this notion that anarchists have where the state has a monopoly on violence. And because of that, only the state is allowed to use violence. So it just doesn't make any sense that we can say, well, it's justified for the state to use violence, but it's not justified for individuals to use violence. Because like we just said, the state is nothing but a construction of humans. Right. So if it's okay for the state to use violence, which I would, that's questionable, but it seems like that's a popularly held belief, then we have to admit that violence is sometimes appropriate. And that can go to, then the better argument would be with self-defense.
Yeah. I feel like, to John's point, that whenever there is one of these uprisings of militia people or anarchists or anything, it's all about assumptions being made or looking behind you. Like if you're smart about it, you're just saying, who's with me? Always keeping tally of like, do we have enough to make this successful now? And I know what it felt like going into the primaries, that we had enough momentum to make a political revolution.
Like critical mass, you mean?
Yeah, critical mass. There you go. Like we might have that to make honest change, but then when that fails, again, I think we're both saying that violence should be a last resort, but I don't know that violence will ever be acceptable in the eyes of the majority.
But I mean, and what I'm saying is basically to what extent is that reality true because of social conditioning and because of what we've been told since the day we were born, and because of this bourgeois society that we've been born into that says nonviolence is the only thing that's acceptable. I mean, I've lived my entire life in the shadow of being told that, violent struggles are not okay, and I had to come to these ideas through tons of like controversy, and like basically what I want to say is there are cases where violence has been used and it was successful and in my opinion was justified.
Why don't you give us a few of those?
Hitler. I'll just give you the most famous, Hitler. If you tell me there was another way to end the World War II, I will tell you are dead effing wrong, and none of us would exist right now. At the time and for what it was, violence was the only means of ending the war. I mean,
although it was other states that it was only through the who was it? Metalhead said earlier that it sounded like his beef with Antifa was that they seemed a bit disorganized. you need some. I feel like in order to fight the fascists on that scale at that time, you needed something large and organized like another state to come in and influence it. But there are examples. Paul has some in his notes here. The Indian Revolution. You want to walk us through some of those where nonviolence and violent tactics worked kind of hand in hand to accomplish the goal that a lot of the times primarily the nonviolent participants get the credit for.
Yeah. Well, I think that's one of the things that we like Genderloo talks about is the whitewashing, the pacifist whitewashing of history, right? So he starts out with the Indian Revolution, right? And the popular narrative around the Indian Revolution is that Gandhi beat the British Empire through nonviolence, right? And to a certain extent, that is absolutely true. He did wonders with nonviolence. I would totally give Gandhi a ton of credit. But what Genderloo points out is that to say that was the only thing that stopped the British Empire is just simplistic and wrong. And he goes on to cite like there was a violent or a militant revolutionary by the name of Chandrasekhar Azad. I'm pretty sure is how you say that. But he was a violent revolutionary, a militant. He actually like would hold up and rob government property and sell it to fund the revolution. And there was another armed revolutionary that was a part of the struggle against Britain and India too. And then there was riots and strikes and all sorts of things. And then on top of that, you take the two world wars, which both drastically diminished the British military capabilities. So there was all these forces that came into actually defeating the British Empire. But largely the popular narrative is to just give all the credit to Gandhi. And that's, I think Genderloo talks about it in that video that we have, doesn't he?
Yeah. Well, yeah, we can play that.
Mm-hmm. You want a video now?
Yeah, the second half of that Genderloo.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry. Kind of just pop that in on you.
Advocates of nonviolence, they frequently say that nonviolence works, and the principal examples that they use of that are Gandhi in India and Martin Luther King in the U.S. The problem with that is that this represents this constitutes a really great historical whitewashing, that in fact the resistance in India was incredibly diverse, and Gandhi was a very important figure within that resistance, but the resistance was by no means pacifist in its entirety. That there were a number of armed guerrilla groups, a number of militant struggles, very important riots and other strong clashes, which were a part of the struggle for Indian independence. So on the one hand, Gandhi basically got negotiating power from the fact that there were other elements in the struggle which were even more threatening to British dominance. So the British specifically chose to dialogue with Gandhi because he was perhaps for them the least threatening of the important elements of resistance. And if those other elements had not existed, they simply could have ignored Gandhi.
At the end of it?
Yep.
Plus, I was also thinking, if you look at what happened in India, it's arguable that colonialism wasn't overthrown at all. I mean, it's pretty arguable that it's still under neocolonialism, just corporate colonialism,
Sure.
So,
Agreed.
But anyway, so he goes on after that. One of the other main pacifist narratives that he criticizes is the American Civil Rights Movement with Martin Luther King. And what he does is he talks about how Martin Luther King was also the kind of given the centerpiece and basically made the center of the narrative of the civil rights movement because he was nonviolent. And it's very true that Martin Luther King accomplished amazing things. He's there's no doubt, nobody's going to doubt that. But like, once again, the pacifist whitewashing ignores the fact that there was tons of other struggles going on in the Black liberation movement. For instance, you had the Black Panthers, who were not just militant, they patrolled cops. They would have armed policing of police. And I mean, Huey fucking Newton was a badass. Huey would stand with a shotgun watching the police conduct their business. And when the police said, you can't do that, he was like, he would quote the fucking Constitution to them and then chamber a fucking round into his gun and said, if you shoot me, I'm going to shoot back, you know? And these were people that made extensive, they were as equally important to the Black community and to Black liberation as Martin Luther King. But when you look at the bourgeois narrative and the bourgeois society that's built up this historical context, they prefer to talk about Martin Luther King because that is what's least threatening to the state. Just like Genderloo talks about how Gandhi was the least threatening to the British Empire and to the status quo. I think that's what Martin Luther King was compared to Malcolm X and the Black Panthers, Bobby Seale, Eldridge Cleaver. You know, I mean, you look at all these people, they could have been the individuals like Martin Luther King, but they were far more threatening to the state and to the status quo.
Interestingly, I feel like sometimes the threat of violence is enough. Like in the 70s, when the Black Panthers were very alive and very strong, the NRA saw a spike in the membership from Black members, and that's when you saw gun control. Like they started thinking, oh, maybe we should impose more gun control laws, right?
Yeah. Well, and what's scary to the status quo when the peons start fighting back, and that's what that was the people that were disenfranchised empowering themselves.
Sure.
I mean, an uptake in Black gun ownership now, and I don't see them pushing for gun control.
No, the rules are a little different now. I'm afraid. It's I don't know what that looks like, or other than we sell more guns, we get more money, kind of thing. But the more, I don't know. It's I don't see the same dynamic today. But I think basically what we can agree on here is that there should be a diversity of tactics, but to the extent of how much violence is necessary, maybe that's where we differ.
Can I interject that it sounds like what you're saying is it really, I mean, the violence begets the times, right? I mean, you have to meet you have to meet the evil of the day with what you have available, right? And if you have a Gandhi and you have a Malcolm X, great. If you have a Martin Luther King and somebody else, great. Whatever you've got is what you got to work with. And I think I want to clarify on, I'm looking at everybody talking, the audience is talking about a lot of different stuff. But, I think we can all agree nobody wants to use violence, and that the end-all goal is to have a society that doesn't have violence. But, we can't get there. I guess maybe the ultimate question is, can we get there without violence when we need to fight with the tools we have of the day to fight the evil?
Exactly. And that's what me and Ashley were talking about before the show, was how ideally, I hate violence. I despise violence. I think it's disgusting, but I also think that there are times when it's appropriate. But in the end, the goal is to minimize violence. If I was going to say the society that I want to build, I'll just try to speak to John. I want a Star Trek society. I want a post-scarcity, like everybody lives in kumbaya. But I honestly think that goal might be achievable, but I don't think it's going to be achievable just through voting and through rational discussion with irrational, evil assholes.
Well, I also want to ask if, and I don't know if, hope maybe somebody in the audience will ask this because our psychology guy isn't here today, but there is a psychological component behind it. And I wonder sometimes if the biological drive to be aggressive towards others, if that is part of what makes us human, and the violent tendencies that we struggle with and that we attempt to repress, if those are just a part of our humanity,
I think that's the part we're trying to. I think we're trying to evolve beyond that. I think that's the whole progressive movement, is to evolve beyond that. And the whole concept of civilization is to create a construct in which we don't need violence, right? Where we can all survive. But it's getting everybody to that education level. I want you guys to hear some comments here. Just want to back up. Al Walsky says, violence isn't necessary if when the people hold those who abuse power politically accountable. Since Korea, there has been no consequences for abuse of power. That's why there is more war. What do you think of that statement?
Yeah, in South Korea, if you're not familiar with what happened there, it sounded like was it Samsung controls like
I have no
a
idea.
quarter of the I think it's the Samsung company that controls like a quarter of the nation's GDP. Like they're
Holy
just
cow.
a huge company for and it's like a family. Like they
Had no idea.
if you watch, how I pictured it was like that show Narcos on Netflix that shows the Colombian guy, the cartel.
Yeah, Pablo Escobar.
Pablo Escobar, thank you. He did a lot of good for his neighborhood, right? In a lot of ways with his drug money. But
but only to bolster himself.
Right. So, yeah, but I also see Samsung doing that, not in the same way because it's all legal on the up and up. They are trying to benefit, but they were also pulling the strings of the government, very visibly, underhandedly trying to keep it quiet, but they were also pulling the strings, as I understand it. And so the South Koreans for some period of time, they were very vigilant about going out and protesting. Like they would have how many, John, do you remember the numbers? But they would just have, day after day, protesters coming out in droves and saying she has to go. The president has to go for taking this money.
Yeah, it was pretty amazing. I mean, they didn't cover it very well on MSM, but it was a huge, massive protest. But I mean,
and it worked like a charm.
But you're looking at a demilitarized. You're looking at a very different nation. I mean, I just like Jilly loves say, violent sports, violent video games, violent movies. This culture we're raised to praise violence, right?
Very much so. And that's why I like am very anxious while I was discussing this, is because I don't want to come across as the champion of violence. Like, yeah, man, everybody should just punch the shit out of each other. Like, I don't want that. I would rather, what I am advocating is what Trey said, is it always should be a last resort. I just don't want to take it off the table when we have no idea what could be coming down the pipe. I mean, we're talking about basically how your tactic, whatever tactic of resistance you're going to use, needs to be context specific. And to just take violence off the table or militant struggle off the table is to hobble yourself against future struggles, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I want to reference, you can disable a piece of a DAPL pipeline and go to prison or be threatened with prison. And does that cause sound just? It does to me. You can smash a Macy's store window in the name of capitalism and greed. Does that sound just to me? No. Why does one sound good to me and the other doesn't? Because I care more about fossil fuels than I do about capitalism. But where do you? I mean,
also it's a more targeted approach. Smashing a Macy's window could just mean you wanted to loot Macy's. Like without a specific.
Well, I'm citing two instances. I'm citing an instance where I actually saw a window get smashed by someone they claimed was black bloc, and it was just for the point of smashing in the window, and then they ran off to go do something else, right? And I've had issues with black bloc. I'm like, look, I get it. You want to make a point, but coming in and smashing up some shit is not making the point. To the concept of Antifa and doing physical damage to things, I got your guy's point here. But when the media controls the narrative and they can say, these guys are assholes. Look at the assholes. Look at these bad guys, right? That's, and I think in the 60s with the civil rights movement, I just want to say, I think we had a more fair and balanced media. And
let's talk.
I would totally agree. Absolutely. We have the most psychotic media right now. I mean, it's just like, you just search. You're like, maybe I'll find a true story today. Maybe it'll be a bunch of propaganda. Hopefully I'll read carefully enough to be able to parse the difference. violence.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous.
Yeah, density. I just want to make a comment to your statement here. You said we are no different than the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire would take offense at that statement. They were far more civilized. They were far more organized. They were far more interested in environmental cares. For the times, they were way ahead of us. So
Probably so, yeah. They only had the Coliseum. We have all the football stadiums and all the UFC stadiums. So
Well, again, that goes back to my point, though. They had gladiators. They had people watch that shit because, and we still, how many people watch the Mayweather McGregor fight?
oh yeah,
or
you're not
UFC,
entertained.
man.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
We
Totally.
need that we like, and I know that you're saying we can. The idea is that we can evolve beyond that, but then again, are we still human? Like, is
Well-
that
Well, that's the thing, though, is like when we're getting into like ideas of human nature, I'm gonna back way away because I'm not gonna make any claims about human nature. But I think that I mean, there is a sense that we have a drive to be violent, and it is important to keep that in check to make sure that you're not acting out of violence just to appease that instinct, I guess, and actually doing something substantive with your action. And I think that's kind of what we're getting at, is that motive changes the character of violence in a lot of ways. Like if your motive is to fight oppression versus if your motive is to exploit, I think that those can be distinguished.
Sure.
I'm not sure exactly how, but
Well, we see them all the time. I mean, we go to war to exploit. All right. I mean, the last war we went to war with because we were eradicating an evil was truly World War II. Since then, it's been a war to exploit.
yep.
Right.
Yeah, just
And-
to steal resources.
Right, and I want to go with something up here. It says Brahm says totally agree with that. I don't know what he was referring to, but he says nothing should be taken off the table when the planet is at stake. Because what we're really coming down to at the end of it is I will be violent when I feel it is my survival that is at stake. And so when you can define that, if I saw somebody else in the audience say, if somebody was going to do violence against me, I wouldn't fight back. But if I saw somebody beating up somebody else, I would stop them. You don't know that. If somebody was beating the shit out of you, you think you're going to lay there passively? I mean, I would be fighting back with my life.
But
Absolutely.
this is the thing you said, that when it affects you, when you feel like your survival is threatened.
Yeah.
And right now, again, under the Trump administration, as a white male, I do not feel threatened, but I feel obligated to do whatever is in my power. And I don't want to get violent, but when I hear people, like people of color or of other faiths or anything else, talk about different tactics, my mind is open to those because I have to trust that they feel threatened enough.
Yeah.
Because I can't rely on my own threat level to determine whether or not I come to their aid. Because if I did, I wouldn't. Does that make sense?
Interesting.
Well, that's what we're saying is like, if self-defense is justifiable, then I think we've established that violence is justifiable at certain times, and it's just a matter of parsing out when it's justifiable. And what we have to do that is on a case-by-case basis.
Okay.
And it has to be extremely well thought out. Anyway,
right.
Sorry, John.
No. I'm glad you said that. I'm glad you clarified, because I would like to just state that I feel like my survival is being threatened right fucking now because of climate change. I don't give a fuck about the Trump administration. I'm watching the planet death spiral, and I am powerless to do anything about it because I have greedy fucking corporations that don't give a fuck. So if I had a choice, I'd take a gun, I'd go shoot CEOs. I just start blowing the heads off CEOs and say, "You guys want to change things? My life feels threatened right fucking now." So tell me, is that violence justified? Because I really feel like CEOs should be hung.
Well, again,
absolutely. I think the Standing Rock people had grounds to act violently.
They should have shot back.
Yeah, they got brutalized. I mean, I think that's why the vets went out there, because the vets were just like, Jesus Christ, this is what's going on to unarmed people.
Right, but now, here, Paul,
crazy.
just to opposite that, myself and you and me, Standing Rock was successful for what it was because they didn't fight back, because they let themselves get the shit kicked out of themselves.
But were they successful?
They were.
Well, they drew a lot of sympathy from the media, from people watching.
Yes.
They got the most sympathy because they didn't get violent.
Yes,
exactly. And it brought
Yeah.
more attention to it, even though they didn't get what they want. They didn't win, as it were.
But that's what I'm saying is, what if on top of the tactics that those people use, there were also saboteurs? They were also, and I mean, I'm not saying that that's right. I'm just saying it's a what if scenario with a diversity of tactics.
There kind of were though. They just weren't at Standing Rock. Like there was the guy who shut down the refinery. I mean, we watched it. Right? We watched like several direct actions. I broadcast them, several direct actions from people that and they weren't violent, but they definitely caused physical damage to property. Right.
Yeah, and that's what I guess I would say is I would say that's just another version of direct action, and that these kids I mean, I would say even chaining yourself to the backhoes and to the that's all. I mean, I'm just saying basically, I know that violence is not the answer every time, but I'm also saying that it's not just going to not be the answer every time either. That it can be appropriate.
Phil Britton was mentioning something about testosterone in the comment, evilest drug in the world, and I mention it because
I agree.
I often think of I think about that like it's males do the majority of like violent crimes, and we're more willing to go to war, and all this, just a history of violence is predominantly male, and I wonder if, again, that's that biology, and if we didn't kind of start transitioning more toward a matriarchal society, and again, I don't know what that looks like.
I'm there with
necessarily, but
I mean, look at Rojava. I mean, we could play that video. I mean, that's actually like a feminist revolution going on in the midst of the fight against ISIS.
Let's talk about Rojava. We only got about 10 minutes left, so why don't you tell us do you want to give a little bit of lead in about what the YPG is and Rojava?
All right, so Rojava, in my opinion, is like right now a great example of what a militant revolution can accomplish. And basically what happened was, after the Arab Spring brought about the civil war in Syria, there was this huge, basically there's just horrible, we all know there's just horrible shit going on in Syria. But the crazy thing was, out of that, this random, they call them the three cantons, and it's just all three cantons together are known as Rojava. And what it is it's this new society built by the people, the Kurdish people mainly, but it's also like Yazidis and different ethnic groups within the region. And they've built a direct democracy. And what's crazy is it's a feminist revolution in the fact that they have feminine figures that are supposed to be, that are central to every aspect of the government. So basically what they're trying to do is completely overthrow the patriarchy. And they're arming, they have an entire battalion of women that are armed that fight ISIS. And so it's basically become this insanely successful campaign against ISIS. And at the same time, almost a laboratory showing the success of a direct democracy and almost some anarchistic principles. So if we want to watch that video, we could watch that video real quick. And he gives a really good rundown of it.
On August 25th, Turkey's thin-skinned proto-fascist tyrant Tayyip Erdogan officially joined the geopolitical clusterfuck in Syria when he sent Turkey's armed forces to lead a cross-border incursion ostensibly to fight Daesh, or the so-called Islamic State, but transparently as an effort to halt the brakes on advances by the Syrian Democratic Forces led by the Kurdish People's Protection Unit, or YPG, which has been making territorial gains in the region that Syria's Kurds have rechristened as Rojava. For many outside observers of the Syrian civil war, the Rojava revolution has been a lonely beacon of hope in an otherwise bleak fucking tragedy. And anarchists and other revolutionaries around the world have accordingly flocked to show solidarity with their cause. This has ranged from the establishment of Rojava solidarity chapters in cities and countries across the world, all the way to peeps traveling to join international battalions of volunteer fighters on the front lines, in an act of international solidarity that harkens back to the Spanish Civil War. Over the past several years, the liberated cantons of Rojava have witnessed some of the most inspiring revolutionary transformations in modern history, most notable being its grassroots TEF-DEN system of participatory democracy and the accompanying self-organization and mass empowerment of women.
Freedom for Kurdistan starts with freedom for women. When women are free, then Kurdistan will be free.
These hard-fought gains have been all the more impressive given the fact that they've taken place while waging an existential war against the genocidal fucking jihadis of Daesh. But while this will no doubt piss a lot of peeps off,
ah boy, here we go.
The uncomfortable truth is that many supporters of Rojava have adopted a dogmatic, uncritical approach to the Kurdish struggle in northern Syria, particularly its military aspect, and in the process have ignored or downplayed actions that not only contradict fundamental principles of the Rojava revolution, but also pose serious fucking threats to its future viability and the spread of values within the region. Kurds have a long and tragic history of betrayal and oppression at the hands of the different states and ethnic groups that surround them on all sides. Under the Assad regime, they were officially banned from speaking their own language and were targeted by so-called Arabization politics aimed at controlling natural resources and manipulating ethnic demographics in the region. One of the main tenets of Rojava's TEP-DEV system has been an embrace of secular pluralism and cultural and political autonomy for different ethnic groups and religious minorities. At the same time, the Democratic Unity Party, or PYD, the ruling Kurdish political party in Rojava, has pursued a policy of geographically linking the three Kurdish cantons of Afrin, Kobani, and Jazira, which are physically separated from one another by large swaths of land primarily populated by Arabs.
YPG militia from the start of the revolution has been working for its own interests. It created an autonomous area. It never recognized the Syrian revolution, but it used it to create its own state.
The efforts to link the cantons militarily has provoked a great deal of inter-ethnic strife in northern Syria, with YPG forces benefiting from both US and Russian airstrikes, in the latter case leading to ethnic cleansing of rebel-held positions in the province of Aleppo. YPG supporters have tended to justify these actions by claiming that the Arab forces they have been targeting are all head-chopping jihadis or members of Daesh or al-Nusra. Hopefully this doesn't become a self-fulfilling prophecy, and the YPG and local militias of the Free Syrian Army are able to come to an understanding and mutual fucking coexistence. This is especially important now that Turkey's military has joined the fray, and Erdogan, drunk on the authoritarian fucking powers he sees in the wake of July's failed coup, has begun further cracking down on Kurds in southeastern Turkey. While it's important that anarchists fully support aspirations of Kurdish autonomy and self-determination, whether in Syria, Turkey, Iraq, or Iran, it's also important to support the autonomy of Syrians in other parts of the country, who are struggling against a fucked up combination of authoritarian Islamists, the Assad regime, and its Iranian and Russian backers.
They are more powerful with weapons, but we are more powerful in our hearts. Many of you have your freedom because of a revolution. The time for our freedom is now.
I love that guy. I love that guy.
Yeah.
Stimulator rules.
More F-bombs than I do. He's like a trip. And I just want everybody to know, you better light up. I know that was serious stuff, and it was really cool, actually. But the video was 4 minutes and 20 seconds long. Just
Oh,
there you go.
Yeah.
the gods are talking to us.
It's all about timing, everybody. It's all about timing.
I freaking love. Well, that's one of the main things that I love is Rojava right now. Like I've studied extensively about Rojava. There's a bunch of books. In fact, if you want to learn more about Rojava, there's an author named Janet Beal. She spent, I think, a year over in the Kobani canton, and she was there for about a year, and she basically just jotted down all the notes of like watching how their democracy works and watched how everything was fleshing out. And I mean, it's a really cool laboratory of what a revolutionary government can look like and what a revolutionary transition from just this market-based capitalist economy to an anarchist communal-based economy where everybody's like, it's almost like a co-op. You know?
It sounded like, though, that there was a bunch of uncertainty even from the presenter as far as what that peace would eventually look like, with so many factions warring, and if there ever could be a peace. I didn't feel the sense from the stimulator that he got a sense that that this would end the fighting.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, this is very much. I think his comparison to the Spanish Revolution is quite apt. You know, I mean, in the end, the Spanish Civil War and the anarchist revolution that happened there wasn't successful, and it was mainly because they just didn't get international recognition at a time and in proper timing. And I think the same thing could happen to Rojava. You know, I mean, if if the Syrian situation is ever resolved, which it probably never will be, but one of my main fears is that we support the Kurds right now because it suits our interests. But I have a feeling that the second it becomes conducive to our political situation, we'll just turn on the Kurds and we'll turn on Rojava.
Well, we're Turkey's ally, right?
Yeah.
And Turkey doesn't support the YPG, so
No, Turkey, if anything, probably supports ISIS, but that's an unpopular thing to say. So,
Well, if we like the Kurds, what do they have that we want? It's got to be something
exactly.
they have.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, that's what's sad is the Kurds have been stateless for so damn long. I mean, the Kurdistan in their minds is like a portion of Turkey, a portion of Iran, a portion of Iraq. But after World War I, the West drew the map, so their entire state was just erased. Basically,
so they're a reason for war. That's what they are. We like them because they're an underdog that we can supply. That's all. That's
yep.
all. That's easy. Thank you, Kurdistan.
Yeah.
Well, if you don't mind going a little bit long here, I wanted to also run that piece from Paul Chappelle, who is actually giving a lecture about 3 miles from my house right now. He's probably wrapping up at this moment. It's very coincidental. I would probably be there if I weren't doing this show right now, just to hear him speak. He's a peace activist. And I like the piece that I managed to find of him actually starts with him saying, sometimes it's just easier to kill people. And this from a peace activist, I thought the juxtaposition of that line was pretty fitting. But so he's in essence, but that's in relation though to state violence, right? Because again, we're talking about what's easiest for. It reminds me of the comparison Edward Norton in Fight Club, where they say if it's worth the death toll, then do we do a recall for the automobile?
Yeah, it's like
industry?
almost like a really heartless calculation.
Right. But at some point, again, we have to do that.
Totally.
With healthcare, again, if a health procedure is $50,000 out of pocket expense, and it's a 50-50 chance that you live, and you're 80 years old, you say, fuck,
Yeah.
like it's not worth it. But
if you have to pay, but under the system,
Yeah, but again, even Medicare for all, there has to be limits to that, right?
No.
Like these procedures. Well, I don't know.
So that's a whole other conversation. You need.
Yeah,
to
I was
talk
going to
about,
say, I think we're about to start a new episode. We're just going to go right in.
we need to talk about this guy who looks like Keanu Reeves' more
Yeah.
intelligent brother, right?
Yeah.
Can you just see this guy saying, "Well, he's really." He actually does bring up some interesting points. I agree with him on the nonviolent point he will make here, guys. That in order to have an effect as nonviolent activists, you have to do the Gandhi approach, which is get a fuckload of people involved.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So
Critical mass.
Yeah, critical mass, whatever that is, is the key to nonviolent wins, right? Anyway, did you guys want to say anything before we play Keanu here?
No.
All right, here we go.
Sometimes it can be easier just to kill people. It's not even that you really hate them that much, it's just easier to have them killed.
Agreed.
And so, if you look at how much human harm is caused, for example, by apathy, how many unjust systems are, if you really look at what sustains them, is not the evil deeds of the people who perpetuate the harm, but the apathy, the silence of the good people, as Martin Luther King Jr. would say. The apathy, silence of the good people is really what sustains these kinds of systems, and that is what allows injustice to flourish. We have to choose the harder right over the easier wrong. And that is the only way the world can move forward if we learn how to do that. As Martin Luther King Jr. said, violence can kill the liar, but it cannot kill the lie. So the underlying illusions and myths that sustain injustice, oppression, racism, sexism, environmental destruction, those exist within the human mind, and violence cannot actually get to the root of what's causing that. So we have to transform how people think about issues. And that's where these battles have to be fought, in the sense that we have to be able to transform how people think. And when you transform that to a certain extent, it creates a critical mass. And that critical mass creates new social norms and new laws. So you can't convince every single person that slavery is wrong. You can't convince every single person that women should have the right to vote. But you can convince enough people where you now have new laws in place, where if I told you that I had a slave and it was true, there would be legal consequences for that. And if I showed up on election day and tried to prevent a woman from voting, I would get into legal trouble. So creating critical mass and then new social norms, new laws, and that's how all progress so far throughout human history has happened.
Sorry, he's awesome. I just got to say, he's awesome. The guys were having a really nice conversation. Robert did notice the stoned duck behind him. I'm not sure what that was about. Anyway, when he said, you can't prevent a woman from vote, didn't he seem a little weird, like he was speaking from experience? That was just weird. I know. Anyway,
they're gonna do what they're gonna do, those women.
Yeah, he makes the critical mass thing. I just want to say a beautiful example of that is with LGBTQ and laws. Right.
Yep.
Yeah.
And look how long that took. That took a long fucking time.
But as he said in another lecture that I was watching of his, and he's I think half Asian, half black. He doesn't really look like it. Like you said, he looks like Keanu Reeves and Point Break.
Well, he might be too. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. Who knows? But he's. But things are getting better generationally. Again, we don't use. In the South, it was known, where I grew up, it was known that the N-word was a bad word. Older generations still threw it around a little bit, but it was less popular, and it certainly wasn't called, you didn't call a black person that to their face. And generations beyond that, we have moved on, and now there are new societal norms of like, oh, you don't even say, because when I was growing up, it was like, oh, I'm colorblind, I don't see color. And now we know that is even demeaning, because it's like you're saying you don't see the person for who they are,
I agree with you, but to your point, and to be quick, because we're running over time here, but I just want to say his point about critical mass involved education of that mass. And therein lies, I think, the crux of the problem is when you get everybody's views changed, you get laws changed. And we got the views on LGBTQ changed because everybody realized they had friends and family members, and they went, oh, fuck, I'm an asshole, right? And so, how do we shift it when the mainstream narrative is certainly not interested in promoting, or is stuck kind of in the middle? They want ratings, which are going to come before providing a narrative that actually brings about this mass effect, That's really the problem. That's where everybody's like, well, violence, fuck it, violence. I didn't, you guys got to end the show on however you want to end it, but I just want to, hang there. You could almost do 2 episodes on this, guys.
Yeah, well, yeah. I'm sure there will be part 2s of some of these episodes, but.
Well done today. Yeah. Well done.
Thanks.
Do we want to cue up that song?
Yeah.
Yeah. You want to tell us, why'd you choose this one? I know you're a big Leftover Crack fan in general. Why this song, Paul?
I chose this one just because, it was kind of cool because Leftover Crack, when I was growing up, even through high school, helped inform my politics as I grew up. Plus, I was in a couple punk bands, and all we tried to do was basically emulate Leftover Crack sounds. But I think it's a cool point that he's making. He's talking about burning prisons and how, mass incarceration is a huge issue for our little society here in America. And Leftover Crack just kicks ass, so enjoy some really good ska punk metal tunes.
I thank everybody again here who is here for live chat, and everybody who's watching.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks to John for hosting our show again in Uphill Media.
Yeah,
and,
thanks.
And yeah, check out the links. I hope I remembered to add them this time in the YouTube description to some. I saw that you were looking for more information on Rojava. I'm going to spell it correctly there in the chat because it was anyway. That's what you want to Google, and maybe we can drop some more links in there as well to the person that you were talking about there, Paul.
Yeah, for sure, and other stuff, articles about Rojava.
Right. So
thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Lot of human turn falls behind.